The moment the Category 4 alert hit my earpiece, I knew tonight was going to break something. I just didn't know it would be me. My name is Caspian Holt, 29 years old, field meteorologist and storm chase coordinator for the National Weather Service Gulf Coast Division, based out of Pensacola, Florida. I have driven into the mouth of a hurricane 3 times in my career. I have stood on barrier islands while the Gulf of Mexico tried to swallow them whole. I have read radar signatures the way some people read faces, instinctively, without translation. I am not, by any reasonable definition, someone who rattles easily. But the voice on Channel 7, the 911 dispatch frequency we'd been patched into for the Hurricane Idris evacuation coordination, that voice had been making my hands unsteady for the last 4 hours, and I had absolutely no rational explanation for it. NWS Mobile, this is Escambia County Emergency Dispatch. We've got a report of a family sheltering in place on Perdido Key. Confirmed address. Are your field units near the barrier? Calm. Measured. Like the storm wasn't a living thing pressing its fists against the coast. Dispatch, this is Holt. I'm approximately 6 minutes from the Perdido Key Bridge. Send me the coordinates. A pause. Then, coordinates transmitted. Be careful out there, NWS. It wasn't what he said. It was the half second before he said it. Like he'd considered saying something else entirely. Wait, because the thing that happened when I finally crossed that bridge is the part nobody talks about in weather briefings. The rain was coming in horizontal sheets by the time I cleared the Perdido Key approach. My truck, a reinforced F-350 with weather instrumentation bolted to every surface that could hold a bolt, groaned against 40-mile-per-hour gusts that were only going to get worse. Idris was still 8 hours out from landfall, but she was already sending her calling cards, down palms, water sheeting across a 1A in thin silver rivers, the sky the color of a bruise that hadn't finished forming. The family was easy enough to find. A grandmother, her adult son, and 2 kids under 6, who had decided that a Category 4 was not sufficient reason to leave a house they'd lived in for 40 years. I spent 18 minutes convincing them otherwise, helped load a cat carrier and 3 suitcases into a county rescue vehicle that had followed my coordinates, and watched them pull away toward the inland shelter at Pensacola State College. Then I sat in my truck, rain hammering the roof like it had a grievance, and I called back into Channel 7. Dispatch Holt. Family of 4 secured and evacuated. Perdido Key is clear on my end. Copy that. Another pause, longer this time. That's the 3rd one tonight. Keeping track. It's a slow night otherwise. The county's mostly cleared. I could hear something in the background, keyboards, maybe another radio, the ambient hum of a dispatch center running on adrenaline and fluorescent light. Where are you heading next? I looked out at the storm, dark water visible between the sea oats. I should probably get off this key before the surge starts. Storm modeling puts the Perdido corridor at 4 to 6 foot inundation around hour -5. That's in about 3 hours. Give or take. Then you have time, a beat. There's a gas station on the north end of the key that's still open. Owner refuses to leave. If you're heading back across the bridge, you might want to confirm he's actually going to go. I almost said that's not my jurisdiction. I didn't. What's his name? Wendell. He's 72, and he's been through every storm since Frederick. Tell him his daughter called. Something in my chest did an entirely unexpected thing. You called his daughter. Here's what I want you to understand, because this is the part that actually matters. I am a scientist. I believe in measurable things. Pressure gradients, wind shear, sea surface temperatures. I believe in data and in what data tells you, and in the discipline required to act on what data tells you, even when it is inconvenient or terrifying. I do not, as a rule, believe in things I cannot quantify. I could not quantify whatever was happening to me on that phone line. I found Wendell. He was a compact man with a gray mustache and an alligator print baseball cap, standing outside his gas station canopy watching the palm trees bend like they were praying. I told him his daughter had called. He looked at me for a long moment, then went inside and came back with a duffel bag already packed. We did not discuss it further. I watched him drive away, and I sat in the parking lot and I pulled out my radio. Dispatch. NWS Holt. How's Wendell? On his way to his daughter's in cantonment. I hesitated. You knew he'd already packed. I figured. He packs every time. He just needs someone to come in person. Some people need to be asked twice. A pause. You figured that out fast. I read situations. Occupational hazard. Me too. Something like a smile in the voice. Not quite, but close enough that I felt it. What does my situation say? I didn't answer right away. Outside, the rain picked up another register, moving from heavy to something closer to percussion. My instrumentation read sustained winds now at 53 miles per hour. Idris was accelerating. Your situation says you've been on that radio for at least 6 hours and you haven't eaten anything. Silence, then a laugh. Short, surprised, real. The kind that escapes before you can decide to let it out. How did you? Your voice changed about 40 minutes ago. Slight roughness. People get it when their blood sugar drops and they're running on coffee and cortisol. More silence. Then quieter. There's a granola bar in my desk drawer that I keep forgetting to eat. Eat the granola bar. Yes, sir. And there it was. Not mockery, not quite warmth, something balanced precisely between them. I'm Dorian, by the way, since we're apparently monitoring each other's physiological states. Dorian? Caspian, I said. Caspian Holt. Two of us named after bodies of water working a hurricane. Another laugh softer. The universe has opinions. I call everyone someone, said like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. It's a long night. Don't look away, because the next 2 hours are when it got complicated in a way I was not remotely prepared for. The evacuation coordination consumed both of us for the better part of 2 more hours. Dorian, and I was saying his name in my head now with a regularity I chose not to examine, was a 911 dispatcher for Escambia County, which meant he was the nerve center for every panic call, every stranded vehicle report, every shelter overflow situation that the county's emergency management system was generating in real time. I was the eyes on the ground for the NWS, which meant I was feeding him storm data, road closure confirmations, and surge boundary estimates, while simultaneously running my own field assessments. We talked almost constantly, not personally, not exactly, but in the way that two people working the same problem from different angles will start to anticipate each other, will start to hear the shape of the other's thinking, and meet it halfway. He would ask about road conditions on a particular stretch of 98 before I'd finished processing my radar data, and I'd look up to find the answer was already forming. I would call in a surge estimate for Navy Point, and he would have already routed the last rescue vehicle out of that sector. At some point, the formal designations started to slip. Caspian, I've got a report of a vehicle stalled at the Bayou Texar Bridge. I drove past there 20 minutes ago. Stall or flood? Caller said stall, but the Bayou Texar corridor is going to be underwater within 90 minutes. If they haven't moved the car, it doesn't matter. I've got a unit en route, but they're 8 minutes out. I'm 4 minutes out. I'll go. A pause. You don't have to. Dorian. First time I'd said his name directly into the radio. Something shifted in the frequency. I felt it. I'm 4 minutes away. Okay. Soft. Be careful. The stalled car was a 2019 Civic with a panicked 20-year-old named Luz inside it, who had turned around to grab her laptop after evacuating and gotten caught in rising water. The engine had flooded. I got her into my truck, radioed Dorian, and listened to the relief in his voice when I confirmed she was safe. Thank you, he said. Just that. Thank you for the heads up, I said. That's not what I meant. I knew that. I just didn't know what to do with it yet. Because here's the thing about a hurricane, and I need you to stay with me here because this is the part that changes everything. A hurricane is not chaos. People think it's chaos because it looks like chaos, because the wind and the rain and the surge create visual and sonic mayhem that overwhelms the senses. But at its core, a hurricane is an intensely organized system. It has structure, a center. an eye where everything goes quiet. The chaos isn't random. It's the consequence of enormous forces finding equilibrium. I thought about that at hour -2, sitting in my truck on the north shore of Escambia Bay, with Idris's outer bands rolling over me like curtains being pulled. The bay's surface was a pale, furious silver. The live oaks along Scenic Highway were bent double, their roots holding through pure stubbornness. My anemometer was singing at 68 miles per hour sustained, with gusts cresting 80, and Dorian was in my ear, steady as a metronome, talking me through a fuel depot situation near the port of Pensacola that had developed a potential hazmat complication with the storm surge encroaching on secondary containment. County hazmat is offline until the winds drop below 55. Port Authority says containment is holding, but they want NWS confirmation on the surge timeline. Surge timeline for the port is... I pulled up my modeling on the tablet mounted to my dash, rain making the screen blur at the edges even through the windshield. 3 hours 40 minutes to significant inundation, less if the eye wobbles north of the current track. And the chance of that wobble, 18%, low but not negligible. What would you do? I looked at the data. I'd treat it as 35% and evacuate the depot staff now. That's what I thought. I heard him on a separate line, making it happen. Then he was back. Done. I sat with that for a second. You already knew what you were going to recommend. I wanted to hear you say it. Why? A long pause. The wind pushed against my truck and the whole vehicle shuddered slightly. In the pause, I heard him breathe. Because it's been a very long night, he said finally. And your voice helps. I need to pause right here, because what I did next still surprises me, and I was the one who did it, Dorian. Yeah. When this is over, when Idris makes landfall and the winds drop and the county starts doing damage assessment, will you meet me somewhere? The longest pause of the night. I don't know what you look like, he said. I know. I don't know anything about you, except that you're good at your job and you eat granola bars at other people. I told you to eat the granola bar. I wasn't eating it. Caspian. My name in his mouth, careful, like he was testing the weight of it. I work nights. I live in a basement apartment off Cervantes Street. I have a rescue greyhound named Pablo, who is terrified of thunderstorms, which is deeply ironic given my career. I am not... He stopped, started again. I am not easy to know. Neither am I. I watched a palm frond cartwheel past my windshield. I spend 6 months a year in a truck talking to weather systems. My social life is largely theoretical. Another pause. Then, quietly. There's a place on Palafox that does breakfast. They open at 6 a.m. even after storms, as soon as the roads are passable. I've eaten there alone after every major weather event for 3 years. Something in my chest went absolutely still. I'll find you there, I said. You don't know what I look like either. I'll know your voice. Stay with me, because Landfall is where everything I thought I understood about this night turned out to be wrong. Idris came ashore at 3:47 a.m., Category 3 by the time she crossed the Barrier Islands, her wobble keeping her just east of Pensacola proper and sparing the port the worst of the surge. I was positioned at the Pensacola Bay Bridge approach, which was already closed to civilian traffic, running final wind measurements as the eye wall crossed. The sound of a major hurricane at close range is something no recording has ever adequately captured. It is less a sound than a pressure, a physical fact imposed on your body by the air itself. I was in contact with Dorian until the moment my satellite uplink dropped. Signal's going to cut out, I told him. Eye wall passage. Probably 20-25 minutes. I know. His voice was completely steady. I've been tracking it. Of course you have. Caspian. Quiet. Under the roar of everything. Just... I know, I said. Because I did. I'll be there at 6. The signal cut out. The eye wall took 22 minutes to pass. I sat in my truck, which I had parked perpendicular to a concrete sound barrier for maximum wind protection, and I watched the most organized violence in nature do what it does. At the edge of the eye, when the wind dropped from screaming to something merely loud, I stepped out onto the running board and looked up at the circular clearing in the clouds, that impossible ring of calm at the center of catastrophe. And I thought about Dorian's voice, about the way it changed when he was routing a rescue vehicle versus when he was just talking to me. Here's what the damage assessment looked like at 5:15 a.m. as the winds finally dropped below tropical storm force. Escambia County had come through better than expected. The east wobble had protected the port. Storm surge had reached 4 feet in the Perdido Key corridor, well within the modeled range, which meant the evacuations had worked. Power was out to 60% of the county, which was bad, but the grid infrastructure had held better than it had in Sally or Ivan. The beach communities had taken wave damage, as they always do. The old neighborhoods along Bayou Chico had flooded, as they always do. 17 people had required emergency rescue, all of them alive. Not a single fatality. I sat with that number for a moment. 17 years in meteorology. I have seen the other number, the one that is not zero, and I carry those storms differently. Tonight's zero felt like something that had been fought for and earned. Call by call, vehicle by vehicle, granola bar by granola bar. I drove south on Palafox Street as the sky began the slow, exhausted transition from black to gray to the fragile pink of a post-storm Gulf Coast morning. The street was littered with debris, branches, a torn awning, someone's lawn furniture distributed across 3 blocks, but passable. The city was waking up with the careful movements of something that had survived. The restaurant was called Magnolia and Salt, a narrow building with a yellow door, still dark inside, but with a light on in the back. I sat in my truck across the street and waited. About the laugh that had escaped him before he could decide to let it out. About it's been a very long night and your voice helps. The back eye wall hit 14 minutes later, and I climbed back into the truck, and I did my job. And this, right here, is the moment I will spend the rest of my life trying to find the right words for. At 5:58 a.m., the yellow door opened. I want to be careful here because this is not a story about how someone looks. It is a story about recognition. But I will say this. He was Talish, in a gray county dispatch polo that had seen a very long night, with dark circles under his eyes and his hair pushed back in a way that suggested he'd run his hands through it approximately 40 times in the last 9 hours. He had a greyhound on a leash, a brindled dog with enormous ears who looked at the debris-strewn street with profound skepticism. He looked at my truck. I got out. He was across the street from me, 12 feet of debris-scattered pavement between us, the Gulf wind still moving at 20 miles per hour even in the storm's wake. And we stood there for a moment that I cannot give you a precise duration for because time had apparently opted out. "Caspian Holt," he said, "Dorian." Not a question. He looked at me the way I look at a radar signature I've been trying to read all night, when it finally resolves into something I can name. That specific quality of recognition, not surprise, but confirmation. "You have weather instrumentation on your truck," he said. "You have a greyhound named Pablo." Pablo, for the record, had already approached me and was pressing his narrow skull against my hand with the complete trust that only rescue dogs and very tired people extend to strangers at dawn. I scratched his ears. He leaned into it like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking for years. "He doesn't usually do that," Dorian said. "I'm good with anxious things." I looked up from the dog. Occupational hazard. He smiled then, and it was the laugh from the radio, translated into something I could see. Something that started cautious and then decided, in the space of a second, to just be what it was. Full and real, and a little tired, and entirely worth the drive across a storm-wrecked barrier island at midnight. "Breakfast?" he said. "Breakfast," I said, because here's what I didn't know yet, and what the next hour taught me. We got the corner table. The restaurant smelled like coffee and butter and the particular warmth of a place that has been running since before the storm hit, and will run until after the city finishes grieving. Pablo curled under the table and put his head on Dorian's foot, and went to sleep within approximately 90 seconds. Dorian ordered eggs and grits and a coffee the size of a small bucket. I ordered the same. We sat with our coffees, and the morning coming gray and soft through the yellow-framed windows, and the street outside still carrying its storm debris like evidence. 0 fatalities, I said. He wrapped both hands around his mug. I know. Quiet. I've been doing this 6 years. It's not always 0. No. I had said this before to myself, but saying it to someone who also knew what the other number felt like was different. It's not. He looked at me across the table. How do you do it? Go out into it. How do you do it? I said. Stay in the center and hold everything together. He thought about it, really thought. I watched him do it, watched the consideration move through his face with the same unhurried care I'd heard in his voice all night. Because someone has to be the steady thing. When everything outside is chaotic, someone has to be the fixed point. I thought about what I'd thought at the eye wall, about organized systems, about centers. That's why I go out, I said. Because if I understand the chaos well enough, I can tell the steady things where to hold. He looked at me for a long moment. That's the same job, he said. From different directions, I said. Something shifted between us, slow and deliberate, like a pressure system finding its balance. He reached across the table and touched the back of my hand. Not a grab, not a grasp. Just his fingertips on my knuckles, a point of contact as precise and intentional as everything else about him. You're going to be difficult to stop thinking about, he said. I know, I said. I've been trying since about hour 2. His laugh again, the real one. You should have said something sooner. I was busy. There was a hurricane. There was a hurricane, he agreed, and his thumb moved once across my knuckles, slow, certain. And Pablo snored under the table, and outside the window Pensacola was already starting to pick itself up, piece by piece, the way it always does, the way Gulf Coast cities learn to do, because the sea keeps asking, and you learn to answer. You okay? He said, and there was something in the question, not small talk, but something that meant the thing it said. I keep being, I said. He looked at me. Something in his eyes went quiet and warm. Me too. We stayed for 2 hours. The grits were extraordinary. The coffee was refilled 3 times without asking. Pablo woke up once to drink from a bowl the owner brought without being asked, then went back to sleep. We talked about the storm, and then about other storms, and then about other things entirely. About his sister in Tallahassee who teaches middle school and sends him memes with a dedication he finds both touching and baffling. About the time I drove into a tornado-worn supercell in Oklahoma in 2019 and had to explain to my supervisor why my truck had dents on the roof. About how Pablo had been rescued from a racing facility and still sometimes runs in his sleep. About how Dorian had gotten into dispatch because he was always the person his friends called when things went wrong, and at some point he thought he might as well make it official. You're the person people call, I said. And you're the person who goes, he said. The morning light shifted. The coffee got better as they switched to a second pot. Outside, the first city maintenance trucks started moving through, beginning the work of clearing Palafox. The sounds of a city in recovery, not the emergency sounds of the night before, but the slower, more purposeful sounds of aftermath. At some point, his knee was touching mine under the table, and neither of us moved away from it. At some point, his hand was back near mine on the table, not touching, just near, and the not touching felt like its own kind of conversation. When we finally stood to leave, we stood at the door of Magnolia and Salt, while Pablo pressed against Dorian's leg, and the Gulf wind came up Palafox smelling of salt and wet pavement, and that particular green smell that storms leave behind. And Dorian looked at me with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is comfortable with it. I work again Thursday, he said. I file storm reports for the next 48 hours, I said. So Wednesday, he said. Wednesday, I said. He held out his hand, not for a handshake, but palm up. An offering, an open question. I looked at it for 1 second that was not really about hesitation, and then I put my hand in his fingers closed around mine. Steady. Certain. The way he'd sounded on the radio all night, like a fixed point in a moving system. Wednesday, he said again, softer. We stood like that for a moment in the yellow door of the restaurant while the city resumed itself around us, and I thought, this is what the eye of the storm feels like from the inside. Not absence of feeling, the opposite. Everything very still, very clear, very certain of its own coordinates. He let go slowly. Pablo immediately moved toward my truck, apparently having decided the matter was settled. I drove back toward the NWS station with my windows down and the post-storm air washing through, and my radio was still patched to Channel 7, Habit. And at some point, maybe 40 minutes later, I heard his voice come through on a non-emergency call. Routine, calm, giving an address to a public works unit. Just a voice doing its job. My hands on the wheel were completely steady.